book, and I went, wow. Once I read this book, I realized that my Uncle Jim was a war hero. He was born in New Jersey. In fact, born in New York, as a matter of fact. And when he was a kid, they did a story on him. They called him the Tarzan of Manhattan, because back in Manhattan in the 20s and 30s, they actually had trees and stuff, and his parents would let him run around the woods naked. And so the New York Times did this story on my Uncle Jim, the Tarzan of Manhattan. But when he got to be like 18, 19, 20 years old, he enlisted in the military, like most of the greatest generation did around the World War II times. And he becomes a bomber pilot. And he was a pilot of a bomber who captained several sorties in and out of Nazi Germany. And on this one particular time, one of the last flights, he was due to cycle home here any day now. He goes into Germany and he gets shot down. The plane is on fire. He gets his crew out of the airplane. They all jump off, but Uncle Jim had to stay with the plane until everybody got off. This is not one of those planes where you just you pop out of the chute, you pop out of the cockpit, and then you just parachute down, because this was one of those bombers that had props in the back of the plane. So if you got out and you just ejected, you were done. So what you had to do was you blew the canopy, and then you had to shimmy down the fuselage to the back of the plane, and then you jumped off. So that's what he did. He shimmied all the way down to the end of the plane, and he gets right there, and he jumps off. The problem was he hits his ankle on the tail of the plane and breaks it. Over Nazi Germany. So he parachutes down. He's in Nazi Germany. The Germans get him, and he's a prisoner of war for about a year. And this book is retelling the story of all this. The great thing about it, New Orleans has a World War II museum now, and if you ever get down to New Orleans, they have this wonderful museum, and they ask all of these old veterans to tell their stories, and Uncle Jim was telling his story. And the guy's amazing. So he's a prisoner of war for about a year, but that's not the only amazing thing about him. Is he gets, once the war is over and the prisoners of war are freed, and they get back to New Jersey where he was living then, they didn't have any money. But he had to make a living. They didn't get a lot of handouts back then, and so if you wanted to make a living, if you wanted to support your young wife, my Aunt Hazel, you had to work hard. And so he had to go to work, but he didn't have a suit. The only suit he had was his Army uniform, right? His Army Air Corps uniform. So he took all the emblems and all the insignias and all the stuff off his Army uniform, and he used that for 3 years. The only suit he had, wore that for 3 years while he was building his advertising business. Okay, and long story short, he ends up owning his own advertising agency down in New Orleans, becomes a big success, and he's now my hero. All because, now my point is, in saying all this, is not to tell you about the hard work that Uncle Jim did, because obviously, he worked incredibly hard to get where he was. It wasn't about the perseverance that he had to overcome all of these obstacles, or the tenacity that he had to work his way through all this stuff. The point I'm trying to make here, when I think about my Uncle Jim, is that sometimes we miss true greatness because we have an image problem. I thought my Uncle Jim was one way, but he was actually totally different. And you know why I discovered that? Was because Uncle Jim told his story. And I had an opportunity to read it. Folks, I gotta be honest with you. We have an image problem here in Arkansas. I'm not from Arkansas. My dad was a pilot. I grew up in California, Germany, Washington, D.C. I went to college in Alabama. I worked in Alabama, Mississippi, Texas, and here in Arkansas. I'm coming to Arkansas from the outside, and so I look at Arkansas a little bit differently than a lot of people that are not from here. And there is an image issue that we have here in Arkansas. People have a perception of Arkansans. When I lived in Texas, we taught a Sunday school class, and one of the couples in our Sunday school class announced that they were moving to Arkansas. And of course, the first thing I say is, think of how much money you're going to save on shoes. You don't have to get a dental plan in Arkansas. You're going to make all sorts of money, right? And it was great. When we moved to Little Rock, they called me up and reminded me of that smart mouth comment. Arkansans are perceived a certain way by people outside of the state of Arkansas. You know what that stereotype is, right? You know, when you ask somebody, well, I'm going to Arkansas, they have this image of this hillbilly with this long beard and these overalls and this hat and a corncob pipe, and the overalls just come down, barely cover the knees, but he's got bare feet and he's dancing to banjo music, and just. And look, I have been north, south, east, west across this great state of Arkansas, and I have to tell you very honestly that stereotype does indeed apply to some places. I mean, if we're just being honest, right? But it doesn't apply everywhere. All right? Well, we have an image issue outside of the state of Arkansas, but you know what? We can't really do a whole lot to change how others perceive us until we change the way we perceive ourselves. I was on an airplane a while back, and I was sitting kind of cattywampus from somebody. They sat down up here, and I sat down here, and we get on the airplane, and I do what I normally do when you get on an airplane. You listen to everybody else's conversations, right? You just kind of eavesdrop. That's what reporters do. Can I get a witness? Yeah. And so I'm sitting just kind of listening to this guy, and anyway, we make one of the stops out of Little Rock, because you can't fly anywhere out of Little Rock other than going to a hub. You got it. So we're in some hub. I don't know where we are. This woman gets on the plane, and the way she was dressed and the manner in which she carried herself, you could easily tell that she wasn't from around here. And she sits very nicely dressed, sits right next to this guy who's sitting cattywampus from me, and they start this conversation, and I hear her say, "Well, where are you from?" And he says, "Well, I'm from Arkansas," and immediately apologized. Have you ever encountered that? We have this tendency, like Lou Holtz did when he was on The Tonight Show, and he said, "Well, Arkansas is not the end of the world, but you can see it from there." I mean, those kind of comments are funny, but they're not. And we cannot change the way people outside of Arkansas perceive us until we change the way we perceive ourselves. I lived in Texas, I mentioned, for about we were held captive in Texas for about 3 years before we came to Arkansas. Who was from Texas? Did you point out somebody? Okay, listen. All right. I would tell this to a crowd anyway, but I'm so glad there's a Texan here, because I'm going to tell on the Texans, all right? I lived in Austin and interacted with a lot of Texans. I have got Texans nailed, all right? I want to tell you, the thing I love about Texans, and I do love this, it's the exact same thing I can't stand about them, and that is their intolerable arrogance. Right? Because I want to tell you, here is a snapshot of a Texan. All right, it's the emperor's new clothes. You remember that story? Okay, the emperor had the finest clothes that money could buy, but it just wasn't good enough, and so he has these people making some clothes, but they just can't make them clothes fine enough, so he keeps killing them all. And finally, these guys said, "We better come up with some good clothes. He's going to kill us." So they convinced the king that he's got the finest clothes that nobody has ever seen. They are so fine that the average human being cannot even behold them. So the king is walking around butt naked. Or is it buck naked? I don't know. Is it butt naked? Or butt naked. I like butt naked. That too. But he thinks he's dressed in the greatest clothes money can buy, but he's stark naked. And that is a Texan. And let me tell you why. Because the time a Texan is born, from the time that they are birthed from their mother's womb, immediately they get a Longhorn Passy. In every class that they take, all the way through school, they are taught Texas history. It doesn't matter if it's history or civics or whatever. In English, in math, in arts, in science, all the way through school, they are taught Texas history. Did you know that Texans created everything? I'm not kidding. I didn't realize that Thomas Edison was a Texan. All the way. So by the time a Texan graduates from school, he is absolutely, positively convinced that he is living in the greatest place on earth, when you and I both know that it's a dry, barren, dusty hellhole. All right, now you got to admit, I'm on the right track. All right? But that's the thing I love about Texans. They love their state so much that even if they happen to get a job outside the state, you know what? They always come back. They love their state. They want you to love their state, as awful as it is. Look, they make fun of Arkansas, but they vacation here. Yeah. All right. I wish our Kansans would just get a hold of a little bit of that. You know, because we live in a great state. We live in a wonderful place. Arkansas has we got everything that a great state needs to be great. And I absolutely love the place that we are now.